So maybe it's a bit late for this kind of video, but I'm going to talk about a New Year's resolution that I set myself before I entered 2025. And that New Year's resolution is to get started with a new technical social hobby that is amateur radio, also known as ham radio. So let's talk about what it is, it's a little bit about its history, what radio has actually meant for me personally, and how I'm gonna get started with it. So amateur radio mostly involves experimentation with radio frequencies, transceivers, antennas, just talking to each other and experimenting with the technology behind RF transmission and reception. For example, some people use amateur radio to talk to each other just in a conversation that can be in the local block, or often even from your own country to a completely different country on the other side of the world. Like, you have frequencies whose signals can bounce off of the atmosphere to reach somewhere else, or which even go through the atmosphere to hit the moon and then end up elsewhere, or via satellites, or which can even be used to communicate to space stations, like what is done until its appreciation to the International Space Station, or ISS. People can send signals to it, people can receive signals from it. In fact, some amateur radios are also building radio transceiver equipment, like transceivers. A lot of them are building aerials themselves, experimenting with that. There are even groups of amateur radio operators who are building various satellites and other long distance communication things, like repeaters that can capture a signal terrestrially and then send it over to another person a couple of blocks away. Other people still might be interested in using different ways of communication, from just talking. Voice is a very common one, but some people are interested in experimenting with digital communication, or some might even want to learn and keep alive the Morse code, which used to be a very common way to transmit messages both over wire and over radio. And other people still might be interested in amateur television, sending photos and video across radio frequency spectrum. And of course, there are also people who might be interested in how radio waves travel, what's referred to as propagation. So it really is a diverse field, to the point that it's not really a single hobby by itself, but rather a set of hobbies that involve radio frequencies. Now let's talk about the history, or also prehistory, of amateur radio, which started off with wired telegraphy. I've read somewhere on Wikipedia that before even thinking of the invention of the telephone, some individuals already had telegraph connections, despite these being traditionally reserved for use by the government and or private companies. There was actually, about that, a bit of an interesting story with the Blanc brothers that Tom Scott has a great video about, but to summarise, these people wanted to use a mechanical telegraph system to transmit stock information from Paris to Bordeaux, so that trading in Bordeaux could be influenced more effectively than by traditional media. They were eventually caught for bribery, and the wire telegraph was put in the shoes of that system. There was actually a law in France that prevented building telegraph systems for private purposes, or hijacking the public system for private use. Kind of. It was later legalized, and then came along a group of scientists who, of course, developed radio. Most notably was the first amateur radio operator in the world, Marconi, who sent out his first ever radio transmission in 1895. Later on, more amateur radio operators became interested. But radio also got used commercially, primarily for ship-to-ship and ship-to-shore transmissions. These early radio systems didn't have a frequency dial like you know nowadays. They cannot filter out frequencies or transmit at a specific frequency. They just transmit and receive the whole radio spectrum at once, which led to a lot of interference. And so, filter systems were being invented quickly after the first radio. And vastly, the use of these radio transmitters was able to be regulated by the government, who mostly kept the majority of the spectrum for commercial and military use. However, there was a portion that the government seemed to think was unsuitable for radio transmission that was allowed to be used by amateur radio operators with a amateur radio license, of course, to prevent interference with other radio operators. As far as I know, maybe those didn't exist, but it is a vague area anyway. So it was the amateur radio operators who at least recognised that through these HF bands you could actually transmit far further out than with the lower frequency bands, and so HF was incorporated into spectrum regulations, and later on, of course, UHF and VHF as well for their characteristics. It was also a Dutch amateur radio operator who opened the amateur radio scene here in the Netherlands, PC2, the most famous amateur radio operator of his decade, in fact, as he sent the first ever radio transmission from here to the United States. That caused a shift into formalising the amateur radio procedure, setting out dedicated bands for amateur radio, and of course requiring examinations and licenses that are structurally issued to transmit over these bands. And that is a system that mostly persists to this day, though during the years, of course, more and more frequencies got unlocked for general radio use, and later on part of those frequency bands for amateur radio. And nowadays, many countries actually have removed or started considering to remove the requirement to know Morse code sufficiently enough to be able to start amateur radio, because in all this era, technological progression has also, of course, meant that there were newer modes of radio transmission, starting with radio telephony, later on all kinds of digital telegraphy and digital telephony and digital data transmission, and of course television as well. That happened pretty much in the 20th century mostly, though nowadays in the realm of digital transmission there's still quite a lot of development going on. The amateur radio really took off, the hobby, when in I think it was the 1980s and the 1990s, there were first the components were being released by industry tech companies, and later on, apparently especially out of Japan, came ready to use units that you could just put on a table, connect to an aerial and start transmitting with on several different bands. And so we end up today. Even though the internet has displayed some digital modes, amateur radio is still a very vibrant community. In fact, there's actually a fairly large and well-organised network of amateur radio operators which are able and willing to provide emergency communications in case traditional communication systems break down. For instance, during the flooding of Zeeland in the 1950s was one of the most famous cases of this, when amateur radio operators pretty much replicated the original communication infrastructure that search and rescue had. A very similar thing happened during 9/11, when the cellular network was completely overloaded, and so amateur radio operators created a replica, or at least a kind of system that allowed people to talk to each other despite the lack of cell infrastructure. And that is possible because amateur radio does not inherently require a network in a sense that we think about nowadays. It does use certain kinds of infrastructure in normal circumstances like repeaters and satellites, but they're not strictly speaking necessary. If you know, for example, via HF, it is possible to transmit very far by bouncing the signal to the atmosphere without using any other kind of infrastructure. There are 2.6 million licensed amateur radio operators in the world, Japan having 1.3 million and the US having 172,000 and counting. In Europe, the largest country is shared between Germany with nearly 50,000 amateur radio operators, part of the Amateur Radio Club and licensed, and the UK having about 30,000 licensed members of the Radio Society of Great Britain. In the Netherlands, I don't really know how many amateur radios there are, but it is a very significant amount. Now we can move on to how people become licensed radio operators, because the license, you don't just get it for free, you have to work for it. Of course, you have to know the basics of radio transmission, electronics, and most importantly, radio regulations and good practice to become a properly licensed amateur radio operator. And for that, there are several courses depending on which countries you live in. In the Netherlands, we have like a free online course that you can take, as well as local in-person courses that you could take if you want to do those as well. For the theory aspect, which is what's absolutely needed to get an amateur radio license, I think it was actually in the 1980s again that different tiers of amateur radio licensing were developed, which in the Netherlands basically consolidated into two tiers. So there's the N and the F license, neither of which require Morse code proficiency here. But of course, if you go to another country, these requirements might change, even though they are still members or very closely aligned with, say, the European Union, if you live in a European country. There's the N license, which mostly unlocks, allows you to operate on UHF and VHF bands and some HF bands as well. And there is the F license, which allows full amateur radio privileges in the Netherlands, which includes all HF, even some below HF, all HF amateur bands, like I think there's the 120 to the 12 and 10 meter bands. Of course, 3 meter, 70 centimeter, which are UHF, VHF allocated bands, and beyond UHF as well, there are some bands that amateur radio operators with an F license can and do operate in. How are these frequencies chosen? I don't know exactly, but I do know why certain frequencies have certain use cases, because of their characteristics and the fact that if you have two radio devices transmitting on the same frequency or in the same bandwidth, again, you're going to have interference between the two. So every use of the radio, that includes communication uses, like your FM and AM broadcast bands, your TV broadcast bands, military, police and commercial communication, each have their own slots in which they're allocated, but also non-communication uses like the radars and use of radio receiver only systems for radio astronomy also have certain bands reserved for them to prevent interference from other users of the bands. And so between those, the government decided to allow scientific research and communication within what are referred to as the amateur bands by individuals who are considered proficient enough, usually by the exam again, to operate a radio and to build a radio themselves. Actually, normally radio equipment has to be approved by the government, and that means that an individual cannot get that approval. However, if someone gets an amateur radio license, they can actually build themselves an amateur radio that transmits within the amateur radio band. Again, why you need a license to be able to transmit even on the UHF and VHF amateur bands. They might seem quite simple, but when you're building radios yourself, plus it might actually work to protect against abuse of the radio, because there are other open to the public in a true fashion radio bands, most notably the Citizens band of CB around 27 megahertz, that are basically abandoned, partly again because of the internet, but also because they are getting abused a lot by people who run, for example, way higher power than is allowed, which again can cause interference to lower power uses. In amateur radio, again, you have some power limitations. I think it's like 400 watts for F license holders, and N license holders it is 25 watts. There are specifications for the band, and this is information that's only valid in the Netherlands. Of course, it depends in which country you're in for your operations. That is considerably higher than that of lower power systems that everyone can operate, like the Citizens band or PMR here in Europe as well, like the little walkie-talkies that everyone uses. And perhaps even way lower than, way higher than things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth use, which is only 100 milliwatts or less, depending on the circumstances and the country again. So that kind of leads me into what radio is actually meant for myself, because just to talk about that for a little bit. As a kid, I used to love to listen to FM radio. We had the top 2000s almost notably back then, but that isn't really a two-way radio system. Broadcast band, again, it's just one person is constantly shouting out audio towards other millions of other receivers. And I actually used to have a walkie-talkie for a while, but I lost it somehow during my place. It was really only when we visited the Aviation Museum in Lelystad back during a bicycle vacation in the 2020s that we actually got to know the first amateur radio operator I've ever seen in person. Actually, it was operating from what used to be the control tower for Schiphol before it was moved over to the museum for preservation. And I got to know quite a bit about the world of amateur radio and what this tower used to do for aviation as well. That was when I first discovered amateur radio. Ever since then, and also before that, I have been really interested in the technology behind radio transmissions. Like, why could it be that on a certain frequency I hear something and another frequency I don't on the radio? So that is that little bit of myself over with. It was just a little part. But anyway, let's talk about what is going to be my path towards the amateur radio license, and also a little bit beyond, though the future is again unpredictable. I was hoping that in this quartile I would, at the end of the normal exam week, I would also try to do one amateur radio exam. However, due to circumstances including having to do a resit for university, that is not going to happen. However, I do hope to get the license definitely before the end of the year, and I'm also trying to kind of get myself motivated to work towards that. And in fact, I've already started doing some self-study about amateur radio, just a little bit, just trying to get it up week after week, a little bit of getting started with the mathematics as well behind all the propagation and the electronics calculations that have to be done, especially if one's building their own amateur radio equipment. As well as that, I I'm definitely going to get what's referred to as a radio scanner. That's a device that can listen to way more than just the broadcast band. It can do broadcast band, but can also do aviation, can do maritime frequencies, and of course important for me is the amateur bands. With a good enough aerial I can listen to those and I can get a bit of a clue on the proper operating practice of amateur radio operators, which can also greatly help in trying to study the regulations and stuff like that. Now there are actually two kinds of scanners that you can get for this. You can get a full hardware based scanner, like a box that sits on the desk or something you take with you. That includes the receiver, the control unit and the speakers. Or you can get what's referred to as an SDR receiver. That connects to your computer and you would use the computer to tune into the frequencies, and then it would get the audio out of the frequencies that are incoming as well. So that's really fun to try and play around with listening, which also teaches you a lot about how radio waves transmit and how you can pick them up the best, which kind of is a great idea to learn anyway if you're going to be setting up your own aerials at home. Now once you've got the license, of course, you're going to need a transceiver and an aerial setup to get started. Now, you know, the world opens up for you, the world of amateur radio opens up when you get the license, but it just takes practice to find what interests you the most and how you can improve upon what you can go from the license in that field as well. So yeah, I'm just going to be talking a little bit about this as we move on as well. So see you the next time. Bye bye. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you do, please give a thumbs up and share this video with all your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.